David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, let's spend some time today talking about Medicare for All. Medicare for All is becoming a bigger and bigger part of the 2020 Democratic primary. It rightly so. I mean, it makes sense. This is one of the biggest issues. How are we going to pay for healthcare? How are we going to organize healthcare? And there are now lots of inaccurate things that are being said about Medicare for All proposals. And there is lots of inaccuracy also about allegations about the positions of different candidates around Medicare for All. So what I want to do today, and I hope that this will be useful and understood in the good faith that I'm presenting it, I want to go through the bad arguments against Medicare for All, but I also want to bring up the more serious and sober critiques that are the areas in which we should be focused, because these are the stronger criticisms of the proposal. So to set the stage generally, if you're already triggered because I might say something about Medicare for All is not perfect, you've got to come back to the real world. There is no political proposal that is perfect or without caveat or risks or liabilities. This is the world we live in. Everything has the other side of the ledger. Everything is risk versus reward. Everything is opportunity versus liability. And what we want to figure out is what proposal or plan is on balance the best and most efficient when it comes to healthcare for delivering the best and highest quality and most available care at the lowest cost. We shouldn't be afraid in serious adult conversations about discussing the pros and cons of any policy, even a policy that we think is the best one or better than the status quo. And in fact, I would make a further argument. We need to be prepared for when people argue against Medicare for All. We need to be able to identify these are the serious arguments to be discussed versus these are the silly, bad faith, ignorant arguments that aren't really worthy of further exploration. My prediction is that most of my audience understands why I'm doing this and will like it and appreciate it. But I do know that there are people who will attack me merely for talking about, here are question marks that remain about Medicare for All, which completely misses the point. So first and foremost, bad critiques of Medicare for All. There are many of these. One that comes up often is the countries that have programs like Medicare for All have small populations. The US is huge, therefore Medicare for All wouldn't work in the United States. This is a bad critique of Medicare for All. Number one, bigger population actually means that you're spreading the risk across more people. There's no one small group or people with a particular condition that can throw off the actuarial realities of what it costs to cover people. You can make the opposite case, that actually the bigger the risk pool, the safer and more efficient and better priced something like Medicare for All would be. That's a bad argument. Now, secondly, you can also disprove that by counterexample, because there are many very large countries that have nationalized systems of different kinds. Germany has 83 million people. Their system is not Medicare for All, but it is a system that is far better than the one we have and has elements of Medicare for All. Japan has 130 million people. I think you get the point. Now, that being said, you can make the case that what will make the US implementation more of a struggle or a challenge are the large rural areas of the United States, because large rural areas can be more of a concern in terms of providing access to healthcare services. But that's not an issue with Medicare for All specifically. That's an issue more broadly in a country that has a lot of rural areas, and it has nothing to do with Medicare for All. Second bad argument that we hear about Medicare for All. Medicare for All will lead to long waits for services, and it'll lead to rationing of care. And, death panels was one of the phrases that used to be thrown around. We already have those things. There is a shortage of dermatologists in much of the US. You sometimes have to wait 3 or 4 months as a new patient to see a dermatologist in all but what would be considered like emergency. You might have skin cancer. It needs to be looked at right now. There's already rationing in our system because for-profit insurance companies are deciding who's covered, what is covered, when and how much. You can already see de facto rationing, and it impacts how people obtain or avail themselves of care that they would like to have. There will sometimes be waits and there will sometimes be rationing under Medicare for All. It will be different than under the current system, but it's not unique to Medicare for All, and it is not a unique criticism of Medicare for All whatsoever. Then you get into the general, we can't afford it. That's a terrible criticism because we can't afford our current system if the barometer for affordability is people can get the care that would be medically suggested at a price they can afford. We already have a problem with affordability. Affording Medicare for all is a question of political will. It's a question of deciding what kind of a system are we going to have and deciding to put in the means to pay for it. Now, there are also, we'll talk more about cost in a moment. There are also just really dumb criticisms of Medicare for all, like it's communism. These aren't remotely serious. I'm not even going to waste your time with that today, but just know that if you hear those words in a critique of Medicare for all, it's not a serious critique. So let's now get to what are the more important and sensible critiques of Medicare for all. We all want to know what these are so that we can be prepared. Seriously, I hope people understand what I'm doing here. I'm not attacking Medicare for all. Despite the following critiques, it may still be the best system, but this is how serious people evaluate important proposals. We figure out what are the strongest arguments against it, and then can we still defend this as the best policy in light of those arguments? Does it stand up to scrutiny as remaining the best plan? First of all, just accepting that Medicare for all isn't the only way to get to universal coverage, we should all be doing. This isn't a criticism, okay? It's a reality. Lots of countries have universal coverage that people can afford without Medicare for all or something that would be equivalent in that country, but with other plans. I've talked about many of them. Medicare for all could still be the best, could still be the simplest, it could be the cleanest, or not, but it's important not to say that Medicare for all is the only way to achieve health care for everyone, because there are many examples from around the world that are different. Second, the idea that costs will go down for everyone or almost everyone, that is a possible truth. It is possible that you can structure Medicare for all so that costs goes down for most people. But if you look at serious analyses, you will see that in order for costs to go down for most people, you need either to justify drastically reducing what healthcare costs per person in the United States beyond just what the bureaucracy adds to the cost. I'll get to that momentarily. Or you need a more modest plan in terms of what's covered. And I'll explain that. Now, this is not my opinion. If you look at the work of the Urban Institute, which is left-leaning, they say that to do exactly what Bernie wants to do, overall healthcare spending might actually go up. I'm just the messenger here. If you do what Bernie wants to do in terms of taxation level, but with more modest covered benefits, then the cost might go down for most people. Now, this is not an attack. Let's be adults. No system is perfect. There are many ways to set up a plan. There are left-leaning analyses that say it is not as cut and dry as Bernie's numbers make it out to be. Now, that's okay. It might still be the best proposal we have, and it would definitely be better than what we have right now. But we're doing an analysis. So let's stick with this issue of cost for now. The argument is, right now, we have all these different costs. We've got employee-paid health insurance premiums, employer contributions to healthcare premiums at many employers. You've got your co-pays. Some people have co-insurance. You have an annual deductible you have to meet. There is a maximum yearly out-of-pocket. It all adds up. And the idea is Medicare for all gets rid of all of that stuff, and it gets replaced with a payroll tax that is shared by employees and employers. And overall, the cost comes down. This is, in total, a claim that has some controversy around it, even when you look at nonpartisan and even left-leaning economists. It's possible that that's the way it would work. It's not guaranteed, okay? There are dense economic papers, which I encourage you to read, from good economists, for example, Robert Poling from the University of Massachusetts, who has consulted for Bernie Sanders, who says the truth is we don't yet have all the details to say for sure that the middle class is definitely going to save. Let me again be clear. Costs might go up slightly they would cover more. So it might still be a trade we want to make, and it still could be the best proposal for most people. But serious economists say it's a little early. We don't really have the data to say that costs are going to go down for almost everyone the way that Bernie and Warren and others have been saying. It's not an attack or a defense on any candidate. This is just the reality about these proposals. Let's do one more thing related to the cost piece. Bernie has said, you raise the money from an employee tax and an employer tax. The employer tax is only going to hit companies that have payrolls of 2 million or more per year. If you look at that, economists generally believe that that tax that the employers pay will be passed along to workers as either wage cuts or will delay future wage increases or will lead to companies maybe not hiring as many people. That doesn't mean it's a bad plan. That's something that economists say is not being accounted for in the broader economic impact of the proposals. That's a serious question. Now, again, this might still be the best plan, but we don't want to pretend that every question is answered by the proposals that we have so far. Now, there's one other detail. Bernie and Elizabeth Warren haven't made clear who counts as middle class. A big part of what they say is middle class total costs will go down. We need to know who counts as middle class in order to evaluate that. So far, we haven't gotten that. Doesn't mean anything's dishonest. Doesn't mean anything is untoward. But we need to know that. Next, aside from who pays, there's the issue of total cost, and this is what I alluded to earlier. There are left-wing economists, serious economists, who say proposals for Medicare for all are drastically understating the cost to deliver care. One example is an economist named Kenneth Thorpe. He was hired, remember when Vermont was going to do state single payer? He's not a right-wing bomb thrower. He was hired by Vermont to help implement state single payer, which ultimately didn't happen. Thorpe has said that as proposed, if we look at Bernie's 2016 Medicare for All plan, which is very similar to the one we have today, 71% of households overall who currently have private insurance might end up actually paying more in total when you account for the tax increases. Now, they may have better access. They may have more covered services. We still might want to do it, but the claim that everybody's costs will go down, this left-wing economist says there is a question mark around that. That's just one analysis, but it's an important one. And it's really important to understand where the discrepancy comes from. Thorpe says that Bernie's plan, the numbers Bernie uses, they change out, when they change out from a private insurance system to a single payer system, they assume that our per person healthcare spending will drop to the healthcare spending per person in countries like Canada and Australia. This is an assumption that may never happen and it could take a long time. What I mean by that is, Canada spends 48% less per person than the United States on healthcare. Australia spends 56% less per person than in the United States. Part of that discrepancy is the bureaucracy built into the system that we have. And when you get a more efficient system for paying, like Medicare for All, there will be a savings. But there has not been a good answer to why are we assuming total costs will go down to what they are in Australia and Canada? Because there are many other reasons, including just how things are priced here in the United States, that will keep costs higher, and that throws the numbers of most of these Medicare for All proposals out of line. Now, you can make the case. Once it's a single-payer system, the government is going to be able to negotiate costs of all services all the way down to what Canada and Australia have. That is a bit optimistic by serious analyses. So that's a question mark. So does this mean Medicare for All is bad? No, it doesn't. Does this mean Medicare for All is worse than what we have now? Definitely not. It would be better. Does it mean we should abandon Medicare for All as a platform? Absolutely not, especially because, remember, a lot of Democrats already oppose it, and it's going to be a negotiation no matter what happens in November of 2020. But we need to understand the details because there are good faith questions about Medicare for All that smart people on the left are bringing up. And they're being brought up because we want the best system. We want to anticipate what arguments could be made against it, and we want to be able to distinguish bad arguments like the US has too many people for this to work, terrible argument, or it's communism, not even an argument, versus, listen, if you look at the cost assumptions in most of these proposals, they seem idealistic and potentially beyond what the facts support. That's the important thing here. And if we go through that, we might still decide Medicare for all is the best system, or we might say Medicare for all is a great system that has these problems, and here is another system, not the lame public option, but serious other ways of getting to universal coverage that have other issues but resolve some of the issues of Medicare for all. This is how we have to think through these serious problems, and I think that's why it's worth taking the time to go through it. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, welcome back to the program. Very, very busy show today. I will just take 30 seconds to say thank you to a few great people. Michael Yurkowski and J.D. Thorworth, the great J.D. Thorworth, are today's new members of the day. The David Pakman Show, of course. We have a whole bunch of different funding sources, but the biggest one has been and continues to be at 40% of our monthly revenue. I opened the books to you last month and showed you this. 40% of our monthly revenue, the biggest single piece comes from direct memberships like Michael and J.D. going to our website, joinpakman.com, and signing up for a membership. I also want to say thanks to Roger Bohm, who has been a member for almost 5 years and is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Roger, thank you. I really do appreciate your support. Join these great people at joinpakman.com. The David Pakman Show subreddit is truly one of the best places on the internet, I would argue, for sensible, sober, and respectful political discussions. More than 15,000 of our viewers and listeners are now subscribed at davidpakman.com/Reddit. And I want to look at a couple of posts that I noticed that are interesting. One is from a user called BadSmash4, who says, do David's videos get titled in such a way as to specifically attract right-wingers? I really dislike the way David's videos are titled. I always have. They're always very clickbaity. They don't represent what David has to offer as an analyst. Here's the thing, and he says, am I deliberately titling videos this way to attract right-wingers? And if so, that would actually be a respectful thing to do. Listen, we do what I think that the entire YouTube titling status quo is basically a game, and we approach it satirically, which is we will make satirical titles that are not necessarily inaccurate, but they are satirically sensational. So, when I'm interviewed on some other show, we will upload it as, David destroyed by facts and logic. It's satire because there's a contingent of the right that loves to talk about how all these right-wingers like Ben Shapiro are destroying lefties with facts and logic. Like, it's not serious. It's not specifically to attract a particular audience. It's just playing around with internet memes, and that's it. I wouldn't read too much more into it. And remember that in the end, the title is just a title. The bulk of what we're doing is really the content. And as long as we're not being, truly deceptive, these are basically meme titles and jokes and satire or whatever. And I get not everybody might get it, but I feel pretty good about the titles that we're using. And, we're doing what we can with YouTube metadata to get the biggest possible audience, because that's the important thing. Another user, LBJ's PNS, interesting, complains, Monday's show had zero mention of Bernie's rally. David complains about losing viewership when he talks about the polls. However, I think his pro-Warren bias is coming out. Whenever Warren does anything in the polls, he's all over it like white on rice. Bernie holds the largest rally of this political season and crickets. And I actually pointed out, we don't really cover rallies. Like we just don't cover rallies. If something noteworthy happens at a rally, like for example, the attempted identity politics game that a reporter tried playing with AOC and Bernie at that rally, we cover that. But this is one of those places where if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If all you want to see is some kind of anti-Bernie, pro-Warren bias on the program, you will find both the coverage of things and the lack of coverage of things to feed that narrative, when the truth is we just don't cover that a rally took place. What we cover is whether interesting things are said at a rally that warrant analysis, if unusual things take place. And therefore, we covered yesterday, in the context of mentioning this was, I believe, the biggest rally of the political season, we covered the content of an interview that took place. That's it. Don't read more into things than what is actually warranted by the facts. Join the discussion at the David Pakman Show subreddit, davidpakman.com/reddit. You know, at first I was going to call this next story, Mark Zuckerberg visibly befuddled by AOC's simple questions. But that would not be, speaking of titles and clickbait, that would not really be an honest title for this story. These are actually pretty damn difficult questions that AOC asked Facebook founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg, because they get to the intersection of things like free speech, the right of a corporation to police content, voter suppression, foreign interference in elections. These actually are complicated things. What was notable was that Mark Zuckerberg seemed not to have answers as to what Facebook policies are, and that's really the problematic part. So let me set it up for you. We're going to look at some very interesting video here. Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg was visibly befuddled by questions from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because neither Mark Zuckerberg nor Facebook as a whole nor Twitter really have answers that feel to the average person satisfactory to the questions that were being asked. So let's get right to it. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez questioned Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg about what will Facebook take down when it comes to news and advertisements? What kinds of ads are considered over the line and against the policies of Facebook with regard to ad policy? And it turns out that the answers are both not so clear, and also it doesn't seem like it's completely known to Mark Zuckerberg, which is a problem. Will Facebook take down an ad that says something false about a candidate? Zuckerberg says, well, we don't fact check ads. Well, what if the ad falsely promotes the wrong election date, as an example, and targets zip codes with disproportionately black voters? Mark Zuckerberg says, well, yeah, we might take that down then, because it's not just fact checking, it's relating to voter suppression. But lots of things relate to voter suppression, even if they're not about election day. So where is the line? AOC says, what if I targeted candidates with incorrect claims that they supported the Green New Deal? Republican voters might be upset with their incumbent Republican elected officials if they believed that those officials supported the Green New Deal. What if I ran an ad falsely saying they support the Green New Deal? These are actually interesting questions, and I want to get into the first clip, and you will see how visibly confused Mark Zuckerberg is.
Could I pay to target predominantly black zip codes and advertise them the incorrect election date?
No, Congresswoman, you couldn't. We have, even for these policies around the newsworthiness of content that politicians say, and the general principle that I believe that. But you said you're not going to fact check my ads. We have, if anyone, including a politician, is saying things that can cause, that is calling for violence or could risk imminent physical harm or voter or census suppression when we roll out the census suppression policy, we will take that content down.
So you will, there is some threshold where you will fact check political advertisements. Is that what you're telling me?
Well, Congresswoman, yes, for specific things like that, where there's imminent risk of harm.
Could I run ads targeting Republicans in primaries saying that they voted for the Green New Deal?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Would I be able to run advertisements on Facebook targeting Republicans in primaries saying that they voted for the Green New Deal? I mean, if you're not fact-checking political advertisements, I'm just trying to understand the bounds here. What's fair game?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I think
so. You don't know if I'll be able to do that.
I think probably.
Do you see a potential problem here with a complete lack of fact-checking on political advertisements?
Well, Congresswoman, I think lying is bad, and I think if you were to run an ad that had a lie, that would be bad. That's different from it being, in our position, the right thing to do to prevent your constituents or people in an election from seeing that you had lied.
So you won't take down lies, or you will take down lies? I think this is just a pretty simple yes or no.
Congresswoman,
I'm not talking about spin. I'm talking about actual
yes, in most cases,
disinformation.
in a democracy,
Okay.
I believe that people should be able to see for themselves what politicians that they may or may not vote for
So
are
you
saying,
won't take
judge
them
their
down.
character for themselves.
So you won't take, you may flag that it's wrong, but you won't take it down.
Congresswoman, it depends on the context that it shows up. Organic posts.
Calling for violence risks physical harm, could suppress votes. So it is sort of a form of fact-checking that they do. And now this really exposes that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't really understand the policy, and maybe even more insidiously, it's possible that Facebook doesn't really know how they implement the policy that they've written down in order to have something that they can point to. Let's look at another clip, AOC here asking Mark Zuckerberg, how does Facebook determine who is a trusted news source? Because this is something Facebook, it's a new initiative at Facebook. We want to mark what is likely to be an untrustworthy source or a trustworthy source. This is really important stuff for independent media like our show. Here is how Zuckerberg handles this question.
Question. In your ongoing dinner parties with far-right figures, some of who advance the conspiracy theory that white supremacy is a hoax, did you discuss so-called social media bias against conservatives, and do you believe there is a bias?
Congresswoman, so I don't remember everything that was in the question.
That's all right. I'll move on. Can you explain why you've named the Daily Caller, a publication well-documented with ties to white supremacists, as an official fact-checker for Facebook?
Congresswoman, sure. We actually don't appoint the independent fact-checkers. They go through an independent organization called the Independent Fact-Checking Network that has a rigorous standard for who they allow to serve as a fact-checker.
So you would say that white supremacist-tied publications meet a rigorous standard for fact-checking? Thank you.
Congresswoman, I would say that we're not the one assessing that standard.
So on that one, Zuck is just shirking responsibility. He's saying, hey, listen, we appointed someone else to tell us who's trustworthy, and AOC wants to get to, well, what about this particular news outlet that is in bed with, associated with white supremacy? How did you determine that they're trustworthy? And Zuckerberg is saying, we didn't determine anything, we just outsourced that to somebody else. So far, Zuckerberg is unsure about what is and isn't allowed in Facebook ads. He says that they aren't even the ones determining who is trustworthy. None of this is particularly inspiring of confidence, but this is actually really good stuff to be talking about because it's so important, and the social media platforms are not figuring it out. The most important thing to take from this is, sure, listen, Zuckerberg, as a billionaire tech CEO who doesn't have our best interests as his priority, we know about him, we know about Jeff Bezos, we know about all of that stuff. That's not news. We know that we cannot just assume that these big tech companies and their CEOs have the broader best interests as their top priority. That's not new. The issue here is, if we had a more educated population, a lot of these issues would not be issues. That's not where we are right now. So we do need to figure out what the framework is going to be for managing these types of problems. Now, Facebook, as Mark Zuckerberg makes very clear, what they want as a policy is, we will do some stuff and create some documents to be able to point to make it look like we're working on this, but it's not really going to fix anything. And when we're asked about it, we'll just waffle back and forth, sort of trying to look, looking like he needs to be rebooted, Control-Alt-Delete. That's not good. It's not good for anyone. It's not good for users. It's not good for political discourse. It's not good for public education. So really nice job by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of pulling out from Mark Zuckerberg both the ambiguities and the lack of clarity around some of these policies. That being said, this is a way bigger issue. Even if Mark Zuckerberg had clean-cut answers, it still doesn't solve the problem of what should be done and how this should be managed. So excellent job, but shows us that there's a lot of work to do along these lines. Make sure you give us a like on Facebook at facebook.com/David Pakman Show, and follow the David Pakman Show Instagram page at David Pakman Show. Big things are happening there.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
So Republicans did a nice little job of executing a sort of temporary corporate media coup yesterday. This is when, I don't mean they took over ownership of corporate media. What I mean is they took over the attention of corporate media when they pulled an obviously unnecessary and just ridiculous political stunt that was meant, again, to take over coverage of corporate media for the day, and they did it. About 30 Republicans stormed a closed-door meeting yesterday as a protest of what they said was being shut out of Trump's impeachment inquiry, what they said was a lack of transparency. The specific meeting was one where Laura Cooper, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, was going to testify. Republicans are saying none of this is legit. Democrats are holding secret private meetings. It's all bad. Republicans reportedly storming in and taking pictures in the meeting so that then the entire thing was delayed. It had to be swept by police for security breaches. And it ended up being a total childish display of nonsense. And in the end, it served only to delay Lisa Cooper's testimony by a few hours. It didn't prevent it, but it did succeed at getting Republicans some undeserved attention. But here's the absurdity, and I wasn't even going to cover this until I learned about this. These Republicans are saying the reason they did this is there's a lack of transparency, that they're being shut out of the impeachment process. This is an inquiry that is being run by the House Intelligence, Oversight, and Foreign Affairs committees. There are Republicans on those committees. Republicans on those committees can ask questions at every hearing. They can review documents if they so choose. The entire pretext or pretense of this protest and barging in is completely bogus. And Axios looked into the details. 13, so crazy, 13 of the Republicans who participated in this protest are on the committees in question. They can question witnesses. They can review documents. 13 of the Republicans stormed a meeting in protest over lack of inclusion and transparency, despite the fact that they are already involved themselves in the inquiry. It was 100% a stunt. Corporate media, of course, fell for it, and that's why I hesitated to cover it. I got a lot of tweets saying, David, you've got to talk about this protest. You've got to talk about Republicans barging in. You've got to cover the protest itself. The reason I wasn't sure is because it was such a patently bogus stunt. But in the end, I decided, it's important to explain first, because lots of those Republicans have access that they claim to be demanding, that it's a complete and total sham of a protest. But also, there's, with everything around Donald Trump seems to include not only lies and distortions and personal motivations, but witness tampering has been a big, big part of everything that Donald Trump has done around any investigation or attempt to just exert oversight that is legally a possibility for Democrats. This could be argued to be a form of witness tampering because this is okay. The Deputy Secretary of Defense, I'm guessing that she's not going to be intimidated by this. But when you're already directing people to ignore subpoenas, when you already want to suppress witnesses who could speak not about the great things you've done, but about the problematic things that you've done that they've overheard, seen, or witnessed, a great way to indirectly tamper with witnesses and to maybe influence them to opt out of participation is to send a signal that their participation is going to be disrupted, their participation is going to be difficult. That also, by the way, how secure was the facility if these Republicans were able to just barge in the middle? And now there is discussion among Democrats of we need better physical security to protect ourselves from Republicans who want to barge in with bogus and ridiculous protests about things that aren't actually problems. Understand the insanity of that. Understand the absurdity of, in government buildings, Democrats may need physical security so that disgruntled, brown-nosing, sycophantic Republicans don't interrupt the legal, constitutionally protected processes and investigations in which they are participating. It almost is beyond explanation with the normal English language. I don't know how else to say it. Every week, public support for impeaching Donald Trump is going up. Reasonable question. David, why do we give, about this? Why do we care about this? The reason we care is that if there's any chance that Republicans will turn on Donald Trump, it's going to be based on public opinion about impeachment. For better or worse, we can say this is terrible, that this is the reality, but this is the reality. Republicans are putting their fingers to the wind, and to the extent that public opinion shifts in favor of impeaching and removing Donald Trump, that is the only remotely possible way that you are going to see Republicans say, you know what, maybe it is time for the president to go. It's not likely, but we do have some historical precedent for it. If you go back to the 1970s and Richard Nixon, this was admittedly historically a very different circumstance. Public support for Nixon's removal was a really big piece of Republicans eventually going to Nixon and saying, listen, we don't want to impeach you, to convict you on impeachment, but we sort of are going to have to. It would be much better if you resigned. And ultimately, Nixon did resign. And that's why this is relevant. So let's look at the numbers for Donald Trump. Multiple new polls about this, none of them good for Trump. New Quinnipiac poll says 55% of registered voters support the impeachment inquiry. That's up 4 points from a week ago, which was up from 46 the week before, which was up from like the high 30s the week before that. So the trend is very, very clear. 48% support not just the inquiry, but the removal of the President of the United States. That's roughly half of the country. On the question of whether Trump's dealings with Ukraine were all to further his personal interest, 59% say yes, they were, also up from previous numbers. Also not good for Donald Trump, by the way, as a leading indicator to further future support for impeachment. Now, on that one, the question to me is, why do 59%? It's not a question of why 59% realize the truth about Trump's dealing with Ukraine. It's what is preventing the other 41% from realizing that obviously Donald Trump's interactions with Ukraine were out of personal interest. Like, what is holding back that 41% from realizing what's right in front of their faces? Also from the Quinnipiac University poll, 58% of independents support the inquiry. 49% say remove Trump from office, which is absolutely stunning. We have a new Reuters Ipsos poll, which shows that among independent voters, impeachment support is up. It's not just Democrats who want Trump impeached. That one says that overall, 48% of the country wants Trump impeached and removed, in line with the first poll that we looked at. And then you have a new CNN poll, which says 50% of Americans want Trump removed, also very high. Now, we can quibble about the specific numbers and the margins for error. One says 48, one says 49, one says 50. One has a margin of error of 3. The CNN poll famously has a margin of error of 5, which makes it on the border of being statistically significant. But somewhere around, if you look at all the polls on average, somewhere around 1 in 2 Americans believe that Donald Trump should be impeached and removed from office. And that's a number that's climbing weekly. This is not normal. That's the important thing to understand. This was not the case under Barack Obama. Republicans hated the guy. Republicans talked about impeaching Obama. They didn't because they wouldn't have been able to. There was nothing to impeach him over. And there was no public demand for the impeachment of Barack Obama. When you look at these numbers and understand the hyper-partisan environment that exists today, 59% of the country agreeing on anything is stunning. That's why 88% agreeing on universal firearms purchase background checks after Sandy Hook was so huge, and still our elected officials just couldn't get it done. So these impeachment numbers are massive. Remember that the public hearings haven't even started yet. It's all just been meetings and requests for documents so far. My guess is that the public hearings will very heavily trigger Donald Trump's Twitter rampages, which don't seem to be helping him lately. So we are just at the beginning of this thing. The concern, though, is we are now only what is it, 53 weeks, 54 weeks from the 2020 election. And if this is going to damage Trump, it's got to get going before Trump's reelection campaign really gets going in earnest and takes over the news cycle. That's where we are right now. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube. Send me a tweet if you're on Twitter @dpacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Donald Trump had another one of these gong show rallies yesterday, and he told a lot of lies in the rally. That's not really a surprise, but he also said something that's more than a lie, or something that is more interesting than just a lie or truth. Either way, whether it's true or not, it's idiotic. Donald Trump was in Pittsburgh. He was giving a speech about, I guess on paper it was supposed to be about energy, but it's Trump, so it goes off the rails as usual. And Donald Trump said that his administration is already building a wall in New Mexico and in Colorado. Hear it from the horse's mouth himself. Take a listen.
We're building a wall on the border of New Mexico, and we're building a wall in Colorado. We're building a beautiful wall, a big one that really works, that you can't get over, you can't get under. And we're building a wall in Texas. And we're not building a wall in Kansas, but they get the benefit of the walls that we just mentioned.
He might end up needing to use a Sharpie to modify a map, I guess, to put Colorado on the Mexican border. Now, if you look at a map, you might notice that, yes, New Mexico does share a little bit of a border with Mexico, but the state of Colorado does not. So I don't know if Trump is trying to keep people in Colorado because of that legal weed or out of neighboring states. We may never really know. And of course, people at Trump's rally, as you heard in that clip, were cheering when Donald Trump said he was building walls in New Mexico and Colorado. Why are they cheering? Like, are they just dumb? Do they want a wall around Colorado, separating Colorado from other states? What about Denver's huge international airport into which planes can just fly over the wall anyway? How does Donald Trump explain it? It was all a joke. Trump was making subtle jokes despite never having shown evidence of the type of sense of humor that would allow a subtle joke to be made. Donald Trump doing, kiddingly, we're building a wall in Colorado, then stated, we're not building a wall in Kansas, but they get the benefit of the wall we're building on the border, referred to people in the very packed auditorium from Colorado and Kansas getting the benefit of the border wall. What is this guy talking about? What an obviously ridiculous explanation. Now, what's more likely? Trump was using the type of subtle, indetectable humor which he's never displayed evidence of being capable of, or Trump just had no idea where walls were getting built, if anywhere. Maybe not getting built is more like it, and has only a limited understanding of the geography of the United States. The evidence says that the latter is actually more likely. The people of Colorado, by the way, are more or less sensible. Maybe they are the ones building a wall to keep Trump out. Since Trump seems to think walls keep people out, he might not realize if I want to go to Colorado, I can just fly into the airport over the wall. The best explanation, Colorado borders New Mexico, and maybe Trump is thinking that Colorado should have a wall on its southern border with New Mexico for safety or something, because anything with the name Mexico in it clearly is very, very dangerous, or something like that. America in 2019. This is it's a sad place. This is a reality. Is more analysis necessary? The one question to you is there anything else that I'm not accounting for that maybe Donald Trump meant when he said we're building a wall around Colorado? Let me know. Leave a response if you're watching on YouTube. Send me a tweet at dpacman. This next story is just hilarious, but it's also infuriating in a way, and I'll tell you why. Donald Trump's former defense secretary, Jim Mattis, who was always one of the people with a head on his shoulders, other than being a total tool of militarism, Jim Mattis was more or less sensible, more or less connected to reality when it came to Trump being a clueless person. Mattis reportedly said, we're now learning, back when Trump wanted to do that ridiculous 4th of July military parade with the tanks that would destroy the roads and the entire thing, Jim Mattis reportedly said, I'd rather swallow acid. That's a quote. I'd rather swallow acid than watch Trump's military parade. Now, I like this because it confirms that Mattis not only had a sense of how ridiculous Trump's actions were, he also had sort of a clever sense of humor. The book we're talking about is called Holding the Line: Inside Trump's Pentagon with Secretary Mattis, which was written by retired Navy Commander Guy Snodgrass. Snodgrass was Mattis's communications director and head speechwriter, and the book has a ton of interesting stuff in it, not the least of which is Mattis's preference for swallowing acid over watching Donald Trump's military parade. The book also says that Trump wanted to, quote, screw Amazon CEO and turbo billionaire Jeff Bezos by keeping Amazon out of the bidding process for a Pentagon contract for some kind of big networking IT installation. So the trend of most of what's in the book is in line with everything we've seen Donald Trump do, which is there's always a personal angle to it. Trump is president and he's supposed to be doing what's best for the United States, but Pentagon networking contract, I want to screw Jeff Bezos. Military aid to Ukraine, I want Ukraine to smear Biden for the benefit of my 2020 re-election campaign. And the real embarrassment is that for anything we can say about Mattis now, he understands Trump is bonkers. He wanted to swallow acid instead of watch the parade, whatever. Where was Mattis earlier, right? Why didn't Mattis stand up to Trump sooner? And we know the answer. And unfortunately, Trump did untold damage through decisions that Mattis could have at least tried to stand up to Trump about. He would have been fired or forced to resign, obviously, but he could have done it. Mattis has buyer's remorse from working for Donald Trump. But where was that assessment at the start? Trump, we didn't have to wait and see who Donald Trump was going to be as president. Trump as president is exactly who we knew him to be the day he hired Jim Mattis. And Mattis went along with it for a long time. And it's important to accept the accurate statements of these former Trump officials to the extent that they're accurate now in hindsight, but we can't allow them to rehabilitate their images so easily. We discussed this yesterday on the bonus show, actually. We talked about it with regard to Sean Spicer, former just embarrassingly bad, dishonest press secretary, who now is rehabbing his image on, I didn't even know this, Pat told me, on Dancing with the Stars. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who is, I don't really know what she's doing, but she could potentially at some point be governor of Arkansas, who knows? A long list of people who, as soon as they leave the administration and they sort of seem to be connected with reality, we often immediately improve our opinion of them. It's great that they're recognizing it now, but the truth is they probably recognized it then. They said nothing. They saw only their personal career potential that was associated with participating in this completely abortive presidency, and we should not allow them to rehabilitate their image in the way that they are so obviously trying to do at this point in time. Remind me who else there is. I mean, I know Spicer and Huckabee are two of the big players. Rex Tillerson, although he doesn't really need to rehab his image, he's ready to retire, at least financially, if not ideologically. But there are others, and we've got to be really careful about allowing them to now just be seen as normal people, because there's nothing normal about going along with it for the weeks, months, or years that they did before they said, I can't do this anymore, or Trump kicked them out. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's an interesting question about how I would handle a particular interpersonal scenario. Take a listen.
Hi, David. I had a question, kind of a philosophical question to ponder about, maybe. And it's if someone an acquaintance who is a big admirer of yours,
okay,
you found out later that they were a rapist and murderer.
Right.
How would you respond to that? Would you shut them out completely? Would you try to, get further details on exactly what what they did? Would you try to understand, or what? I'm curious.
Listen, I have no idea. This has never happened to me before. I've never found out that an acquaintance or friend or something is a rapist or a murderer, and I don't know what would happen. I mean, I could give you some answer. I could say, oh, I would definitely cut them out of my life. I could never have contact with them again. Or I could say, listen, I would try to understand, and if it was far enough in the past, at the time when they were really a different person, then I have no idea. I think the details probably would matter. My guess is that there are people in our audience who, listen, there must be people in our audience who are acquainted with, maybe not murderers, but more than likely, at least some people in the audience. The audience is big enough where there's probably people acquainted with rapists. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear from others what it was like when something like that was revealed. I think that, this is like when people say, if I was on a plane and a terrorist did X or Y, here's how I would react. I don't think we know until we're in these situations. I think there's so much in the details, and I wouldn't even pretend to be able to say definitively what it is that I would do. Let me know what you think. If you've been in such a situation, I would be interested in hearing from you. We've got a great bonus show for you today. We will talk about something that is happening within the healthcare field, the healthcare industry, that is not discussed nearly as much as how we pay for healthcare, Medicare for all, etc., which is huge burnout among doctors and nurses. I have some personal stories actually to tell about this. We will also talk about, a lot of people are going crazy about this, and Joe Rogan tweeted about it. And I tweeted back that I think people are misunderstanding. There's a bill that's been proposed in Massachusetts that would ban the word bitch, and people are going crazy about language policing and all this stuff. If you understand what it is that is going on, you would realize that this is like nothing, that this shouldn't even be a news story. And then lastly, a Georgia sheriff started putting no trick-or-treating signs in the yards of sex offenders in advance of Halloween, and the sex offenders are now suing. We will talk about the legal and the social and the cultural and the logical when it comes to that story. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. The show can continue. There is more show. 2 ways to access it: become a member at joinpacman.com or become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Much more coming up on the bonus show. Otherwise, we'll talk to you tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.